This past year, World of Warcraft turned 10 and Warcraft the franchise turned 20. This video takes a look at the first 10 years of the Warcraft franchise, which takes the form of 3 really incredible real-time strategy games. One released in '94, one released in '95, and the third one released in 2002. These games really grew up alongside gaming as a medium, and it's really fascinating to look back at the trilogy as a whole, especially how it came to shape World of Warcraft. Let's get started.
This past year, Warcraft celebrated its 20th anniversary. Blizzard, the company behind Warcraft, has come up from very humble beginnings to occupy an incredibly unusual position in the business world, a financial juggernaut that the fans really love and that really loves its fans back. The Warcraft franchise has been the keys to the kingdom for Blizzard, not just because World of Warcraft is such a solid game, but because even in the decade before WoW, the franchise was an industry groundbreaker. Warcraft is at the root of so many of today's most popular games. StarCraft, Defense of the Ancients, and more trace their lineage back to Blizzard's genuinely classic real-time strategy trilogy. If you go back to 1994's original flavor Warcraft, there is absolutely no way that you or me or anyone would say, oh, this is definitely going to make hundreds of millions of dollars over the course of 2 decades. But it did. And that uncertainty is there if you go back to gaming in 1994 from whatever angle you look at it. The original Warcraft came out at a time when the genres of today were still being invented and defined. Warcraft, alongside Westwood's Command & Conquer series, established the basic mechanics and rhythms that real-time strategy games still use today, more or less. The original Warcraft is a pretty distant ancestor in a lot of ways, complexity, polish, pacing, but the fun thing about it is that a player only familiar with StarCraft 2 would still be able to figure it out and excel at it within pretty short order. Not many gamers these days remember the first Warcraft, but they don't need to. Whether it's gameplay mechanics or characters who still pop up from time to time in World of Warcraft, the legacy that grew from the first game is arguably much more impressive than the game itself. That doesn't make it any less interesting to go back and take a look at it, though, 20 years after the fact. Older games are noted for their complexity relative to today's games, but in terms of real-time strategy, that's not always the case. With war games like these, complexity has generally gone up as technology improves. The better the hardware, the more numerous the units. The fancier the animations, the bigger the battlefields, and the larger the number of play options. Although real-time strategy was a viable genre since the early 80s, Warcraft 1 is at the very beginning of computers being fast enough to render large battles in actual real-time with enough pixels to give the player a pretty good idea of what was going on. Westwood's Dune 2, released in 1992, beat Warcraft to the punch in terms of general formatting, but Warcraft is very much its own RTS, from setting to mechanics to attitude. It's also very difficult. The difficulty in the first Warcraft is, unfortunately, as much from clunky interface and poor unit AI as from the campaign's intended strategic challenge. I've talked a lot about how important Warcraft 1 was in establishing an enduring gameplay template, but it is very much a rough draft of the template. The basics are all there. Use your peasants or peons to harvest gold from mines and lumber from trees, build farms to increase your unit cap, build your army from 1 or more barracks, upgrade your town hall to access the next tier of units and buildings, defend, attack, win. All the things that are enjoyable about all the Blizzard strategy games, Warcraft or StarCraft. But doing those things here in the first game is an incredible pain in the ass. All of your production structures produce 1 unit at a time with no queue. And a feature that would be dropped for later titles, all your structures must be connected along a road network. While the units are a good tactical mix, you may only select 4 at a time. Only 4. That, more than any other shortcoming, makes this game really difficult to play. Only being able to control a tiny handful of units is made more problematic by a more aggressive fog of war than nearly any RTS I've seen besides Total Annihilation. You start out most maps not even knowing where a gold mine is, not being able to see where the forests start. In this way, Warcraft requires a lot of patience to explore the map and make a tactical assessment of what you're even supposed to do. Later Blizzard games, starting with StarCraft, put a lot of effort into giving the player clear direction. Warcraft 1 does not. To win Warcraft, you have to fight the enemy, sure, but you also have to fight the fact that your units are dumber than a bag of hammers. They're very bad at anything that you do not tell them to do, and even then it's possible they might walk halfway across the map in the wrong direction to die, even if you tell them exactly what it is you want from them. If you leave them to their own devices, units almost never engage with the enemy unless they're attacked directly. If you don't notice your base being attacked, your defenders will actually sit there giving the raiding party stern looks until you explicitly tell them to do something about it. The game even knows this. Control of the map is all about control of bridges and other choke points, where enemy units literally cannot get by without directly attacking your forces and provoking a response. Units are also a lot more fragile than later titles, which, coupled with only being able to select 4 units at a time, can lead to assaults that fall apart so quickly while you struggle to micromanage. Strangely, the easiest way to overcome this is to slow down the game speed, take the real-time out of the real-time strategy. As the units agonizingly inch their way across the screen, you can issue attack orders more leisurely, and make sure that you don't have just a few of your units hit the enemy's front lines, just to die as the rest of your raiding party gets hung up on a stand of trees. From a technical perspective, it's all kinda janky. But Warcraft had more going for it than just bare-bones gameplay. It has huge personality for a simple little game. Art direction and sound design, even here in 1994, are quite distinctively Warcraft. A fun, memorable blend of bright, cartoonish art with a lot of blood and a lot of charmingly distinctive character and building designs, backed by an upbeat and likable soundtrack, expressive sound effects, and a winkingly silly ambient dialogue. Warcraft is kind of a chore to play, but it's a chore that's clearly trying to be as entertaining as possible along the way, and its offhand charisma makes up for many of its technical shortcomings. As far as the campaigns go, they're both straightforward, simple, and relatively identical. Both orc and human armies are mirrors of each other, the difference is principally cosmetic, besides spellcasters who do differ a little. But balance in the first game is achieved by equivalence rather than encouraging different playstyles, like Command & Conquer's GDI and Nod. Warcraft 3 would shake that up, but for the first couple of games, orc and human campaigns are more or less just about which aesthetic you prefer. All the campaign missions are mostly the same, just moving in opposite directions. The missions are also much less complex than in later titles, but controlling battles at scales any larger than what Warcraft 1 tries to accomplish with the interface frustrations that the game causes a player would be recipes for disaster and some really unfair losses on the player's part. The template is all here, but it needed a lot of refinement. Same thing for the plot. According to an IGN article, Warcraft developer Bill Roper found out that there was no actual script when he sat down to record the narration, so he literally made up the founding lore of a multi-million-dollar franchise on the spot, ad-libbing lines and inventing characters that would be featured and expanded on in games, novels, and comic books for 20 years over the course of an afternoon. In a way, Warcraft is representative of early gaming as a whole this way. Untried, unstable, likable experiments in genre and construction whose influence was a complete unknown, whose long-term success was an enthusiastic guess. Roper's original ad-libs have been refined and corrected over time, and Blizzard's official version of Warcraft 1 is now codified in the novels Rise of the Horde and The Last Guardian. The Orc campaign, where Stormwind is destroyed, is considered the canonical victory, with the addition of the human campaign mission where you kill the wizard Medivh. For World of Warcraft players, these are important names in major places. Here, in 1994's Warcraft 1, Stormwind is about 2 square inches of highly pixelated screen space, but as your wolf riders hack it to the ground and fire blooms from its tiny little spires, a player knows damn well they're still witnessing a legendary moment. Technical refinements wouldn't be too far off, either. Warcraft 1 came out in November 1994, and Warcraft 2 was released in December 1995. Warcraft 2 is better in every way than the original, and its ambition is practically bursting from behind every pixel. It's a great game, and stayed a great game for years. Blizzard even re-released it in 1999 with Battle.net connectivity. People still even play it competitively, though not too many people anymore. Blizzard still sells it. It deserves this longevity. Warcraft 2 is an amazing RTS, and it, more than any other Blizzard title of the mid-90s, set in stone the company's reputation for quality and personality. It prompted an RTS rivalry between Blizzard and Westwood Studios that would last for another solid decade, driving development of some of the most amazing RTS games both companies would ever produce. It all starts here. Warcraft 2 carries over and doubles down on both the charm and the challenge of the first game while making huge improvements to the interface and controls. Critically, Warcraft 2 is considerably more mouse-driven than the previous game, allowing you to issue orders quickly and without having to rely on hotkeys so much. It's the same mouse-driven, hotkey-supported play that StarCraft 2 still uses. If you've played that game, you literally already know how to play all of Warcraft 2. It also establishes the pattern for Blizzard campaigns for the next 20 years, 3 or 4 missions in an act divided by short cinematic cutscenes. The cutscenes in Warcraft 2 are really rough, though, especially compared to the insane level of detail in later titles, starting with Warcraft 3. But they got a fun, off-the-cuff attitude that's really enjoyable. Really, the whole game does. You can select up to 9 units at a time this time, which makes the game so much more playable as well. Pathfinding and unit automation is better, but still not great. It's still pretty common to see units forgetting to attack, but at least the attack area command is actually pretty functional here in the second title. Defensive structures were added. All of these improvements in the controls, army compositions, and interface are incredibly important because Warcraft 2 also expands the scope of battles and battlefields far beyond the ambitions of the first title. Warcraft 2 not only forces you to battle on land, but also introduces air and naval combat to the mix, while at the same time making maps 2 or 3 times larger than those in the first game and pitting you against 2 or 3 times as many enemy forces. Both campaigns are, like the first game, mostly identical to each other. They start out incredibly easy, too. They're about a solid 7 levels per campaign, where the main goal of the mission is only to introduce you to units and mechanics. It's important to put this into perspective. This was pretty much the 4th modern real-time strategy game. There was Dune 2, there was the first Warcraft, there was Command & Conquer, and then there was this. Warcraft 2 was many gamers' very first real-time strategy title. So, the game takes its time to make sure that you're up to speed with it before ramping up the difficulty. Then, when it does get hard, holy shit does it get hard. Unlike the first game where you're battling the interface as much as the enemy, here pretty much all the challenge is tactical. It's got that mid-90s severity to it when it comes to making mistakes. Warcraft 2 is shockingly unforgiving if you're used to a modern Blizzard campaign. Like the first Warcraft, your units are very fragile. You also need to know how to use mixes of those units to counter enemy strategies and pay close attention to how your own units are attacking and handling their business. Again, adjusting game speed is pretty much key to larger battles. The computer has a much easier time micromanaging than the player does, and unless your force is genuinely overwhelming, you'll need a little time slowdown to get all of your orders issued. Friendly fire is also a major concern. Catapults, dragons, and griffin riders will all damage your own units if you don't position and fire them carefully. If you have several griffin riders in a circle attacking a building, they will all kill each other in the process. They will destroy your own raiding parties if you aren't extremely careful. In this way, Warcraft 2 is a game of extreme patience. It's not enough just to have the unit, you have to micromanage the unit to the point of making sure it's facing the right direction during an attack. Fog of War is still pretty aggressive too, but feels more manageable and less artificial. All in all, the way you build units and explore the map isn't really too far off from contemporary real-time strategy titles, just with less polish and more challenge. The only thing missing from the first game is dungeon missions, something Blizzard would enthusiastically return to in StarCraft and Warcraft 3. But here, in Warcraft 2, it's just battles, 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 till you just can't battle no more. In fact, patience is as valuable in Warcraft 2 as gold or timber or oil, especially oil. This third resource, used exclusively for naval and high-end building construction, is a real drag on the game. Naval battles in general are fun and novel, but they feel a little unnecessary, a good idea that in practice adds about 20 to 30 minutes to every level where naval battles occur. This is actually most levels. For whatever reason, Warcraft 2 designed its maps to incorporate naval segments into damn near every engagement. Levels, especially later on, take place across a relentless sequence of islands, deltas, archipelagos. Whatever map design forces the player to make amphibious landings once, twice, 3 times or more to complete your objectives. In theory, and occasionally in practice, this adds an exciting new tactical dimension to the game. But having to do it so frequently makes it feel like an artificial barrier to advancement. It's not really that surprising that they dropped naval stuff for later titles. Nearly everything else about Warcraft 2 would carry over, though. While human and orc units are still rough parallels of each other, there are a lot more units than the first game, and their animations are a lot more colorful and fun. While some units, like the Ogre Magi and with Bloodlust, are a little overpowered, the balance of the game is still pretty solid. Both orc and human forces feel unique, vivid, and well-matched, and both campaigns do something that would become incredibly important later on. They pretty much went about inventing the world of Warcraft. Lordaeron, Hillsbrad, Quel'Thalas, almost every area of the Eastern Kingdom is touched on, however briefly, by the campaign. It's pretty epic. But it only really feels epic toward the end of the campaign. Honestly, the game feels a little short in comparison with other Blizzard real-time strategy titles. By the time the easy first 8 levels are over, you're 2/3 done. Of course, the last third takes longer to play than the first 2/3, but still, the real meat of the game is a little underwhelming. Its expansion pack, Beyond the Dark Portal, would change that. Beyond the Dark Portal changes a lot, actually, and it's strange that it isn't more talked about. It is, with the exception of top-level competitive StarCraft multiplayer and hardcore Diablo 3, the most difficult Blizzard game that there is. The difficulty of Beyond the Dark Portal and its length are both completely out of control, but in a good way. Expansion packs were all about delivering more of what people loved about the first game, but with more challenge and more features for true fans. Beyond the Dark Portal was an outrageous value for what it was by that metric. First off, the campaigns are very distinct from one another. The human campaign begins in Azeroth and then crosses through the Dark Portal to take the fight to Draenor, the homeworld of the Orcs. In the Orc campaign, it's vice versa, a brief Orc versus Orc act in Draenor where you and Grom Hellscream help prepare for a second invasion of Azeroth, and then the rest of the campaign is executing that plan. They are incredibly different campaigns for the first time in franchise history. The expansion also starts off being hard, and then dials up the challenge right towards impossible. Contemporary design values the players being able to complete the game much more than presenting a challenge that only the most capable players can manage. Beyond the Dark Portal does not seem to really even expect you to be able to beat it. Its value is to challenge you past the limits of your abilities so you either improve or lose. It's very blunt about it. It also makes reviewing the expansion difficult because I am not, nor ever will be, good enough to truly beat it. The game rewards players who invested months, if not years, of playtime into truly mastering the game by giving them a challenge that's worthy of their skill. I admire that, and I admire anyone who's beaten Beyond the Dark Portal with nothing but their own skill. In my opinion, they ought to give you a goddamn application of West Point after the credits screen. To cruise through and try and pry into the deeper parts of the expansion, I had to cheat my ass off. I never would have finished this video if I hadn't. I'd still be trying to work my way through the last couple of missions of either campaign. Perhaps that's why it's so seldom discussed. The only ones who can really comment on its construction and its depth are the mighty few who bested it. That's got to be pretty tight company in 2015. But beating the game is also as tedious as it is difficult in some ways, most notably the many missions that require you to kill all enemy units across these huge maps. With a fog of war as severe as Warcraft 2's, this can take ages, hunting down the lone stragglers hidden among the trees and blending into your mini-map. That's a problem for the main game, but the huge maps of the expansion really double down on the problem. It takes great patience in addition to great skill to beat Beyond the Dark Portal, and I do not always cut it in those departments. For the more average sort, like me, there's still a lot to like about Beyond the Dark Portal, even if it is impenetrably difficult. The funnest thing is the consistently strong use of hero units. Stronger and tougher than the average unit, these are persistent story characters who could actually lead in-game assaults. You just couldn't let them die. The campaign has a much more in-depth story than Warcraft 1 or 2 does, with a lot more exposition, and a few fun twists, so having characters persist in the game world makes it all feel more immediate. When Blizzard released StarCraft a couple years later, they'd bring hero units back in a big way, and even more so when Warcraft 3 rolled around. But you'll find that the genesis of hero units is a classic Blizzard gameplay device way back here in Beyond the Dark Portal. The emphasis on naval combat is reduced considerably from the main campaign too, making the in-game pacing a little smoother and naval engagements more enjoyable when they do come up. Ultimately, these complex missions effectively explore most of the tactical situations you could possibly come up with for this game, and also serve to expand the lore of Warcraft in some pretty interesting ways. Mostly, Warcraft is really derivative high fantasy. Lord of the Rings pretty much set the template for high fantasy, and initially in the first game it really wasn't clear what was distinct about Warcraft. By the end of Beyond the Dark Portal, that's easier to see. By making the orcs extra-dimensional invaders spurned on by shadowy demon masters, Blizzard was doing at least something different, and they've continued to do something different. Characters they introduced in this expansion were picked up on again just last year. Warlords of Draenor, the most recent World of Warcraft expansion, ties in directly with the chaotic climactic events of Beyond the Dark Portal. This expansion also introduces the dragon Deathwing, star of the show in the World of Warcraft expansion Cataclysm. And Beyond the Dark Portal ends with the shattering of Draenor and the creation of Outland, a world which would be revisited in the Warcraft 3 expansion Frozen Throne and the Burning Crusade, which was World of Warcraft's very first expansion. The plot events of Warcraft 2 and its expansion have also been turned into novels, simply titled Tides of Darkness and Beyond the Dark Portal. I'm not entirely sure if those are still in print, but they're easily found used online. In any case, if you fancy yourself a top-notch StarCraft 2 player or a massive World of Warcraft fan, this frequently passed-over expansion is a goldmine of early Warcraft lore and razor-sharp real-time strategy-level design. Many of the concepts it introduced would be refined and incorporated into StarCraft. 6 years would pass without another Warcraft. Then Warcraft 3 hit, and it hit like a Mack truck. Warcraft 3 was a rare moment in consumer endgaming where years of hype culminated in a game that actually delivered on all of its promises. Gamers who were there, I'm sure, remember trying to choose which of the 4 races they wanted on the box cover. Orc and human, of course, but now 2 more races, the undead and the night elves. What's with that? StarCraft made 2 major changes to the Blizzard RTS format that would carry over in a big way to Warcraft 3. The first was to abandon the idea of 2 opposite campaigns for each race. For StarCraft, each race had its campaign take place in chronological order to follow a plot that lasts the whole game, Terran, Zerg, then Protoss. The second thing was to abandon the parallel construction of the units and structures. Each race in StarCraft encouraged its own distinct play style, and their units were extremely distinct from one another. Warcraft 3 takes both these changes and runs with them. This time with 4 races, 4 campaigns, and a plot told almost entirely in-game using a brand new 3D engine. Warcraft 3 is the first game that's immediately identifiable as a modern Blizzard title. Its art style would persist almost unchanged into World of Warcraft, and the difficulty is completely retooled to be accessible to more casual RTS fans with a harder difficulty mode for Warcraft veterans. Warcraft 3 plays today as smoothly, easily, and charismatically as the day it was released. It's a genuinely fantastic RTS. And, like how Warcraft 2 was meant to introduce players to the general idea of real-time strategy games, Warcraft 3 is excellent in gently ramping up difficulty as new concepts are introduced. That progression is handled in an incredibly cinematic way, too. Cinematic for 2002, maybe, but the scenery-chewing capital-letter high-fantasy thrill of it comes across loud and clear. Pretty incredible just how contemporary this 13-year-old game still feels. From its gameplay, to its presentation, to its instantly recognizable aesthetic, Warcraft 3 is a triumphant moment in PC gaming. That triumph is all in the details. Way more so than StarCraft, Warcraft 3 is a hero-driven game. Not only the campaign, but the multiplayer as well is oriented around classic Warcraft army building with powerful hero units at the forefront, using exotic abilities and a 6-item inventory to break the enemy on the front lines or support the masses of regular troops. Unlike in StarCraft and Warcraft 2, your heroes can die and it isn't a problem. You just have to spend gold to revive them at an altar. This way, there's no reason to hold them in reserve, worried you'll lose the level. Throw them right into the thick of it, let them get their hooves and claws and hands dirty. It's the way it's supposed to be. And as levels progress, in-game cutscenes trigger and advance the plot while the level is already underway. Even StarCraft told its story primarily in between the missions. This in-game approach was pretty revolutionary, especially when you consider just how much plot and dialogue there is in the game. Motivations in Warcraft 3 are never unclear. The narrative drives the game forward as much as the unfolding tactical situations. And while the dialogue is extremely cheeseball, it's still really likable. The voice actors put in an earnest performance, and while the characters are all kinda cliché, it's easy to become invested in them. The good guys are great guys, the villains are delightfully mustache-twirlingly evil, and characters do come to occupy the spaces in between as the narrative develops. First, there's the game's tutorial, which introduces you to Thrall, an orc you could really have a beer with, as he and good old Grom Hellscream abandon Azeroth and flee across the ocean. There's great danger coming, you see, and no one can stop it. And then the human campaign. The human campaign might be one of the best introductions to a real-time strategy game I've ever seen. The narrative of Warcraft 3 is closely oriented around events that the players can directly participate in this case, the story of the rise and fall of the paladin Arthas. Arthas is right in the middle of an outbreak of a strange plague being spread through the granaries of Lordaeron, a plague that causes the dead to rise and go to war. This isn't orcs versus humans anymore, this is something new and much cooler. Arthas is a good guy, sure, but he's prideful. They establish that early. And they establish early that the undead threat is goading Arthas into pursuit. Long before he does anything truly, demonstrably evil, the player knows pretty well that Arthas is kind of a son of a bitch and bound for trouble. The way the conflict escalates from level to level as the stakes of the undead plague grow higher feels not only natural, but incredibly compelling. It's not terrifically original, but it's presented with an undeniable energy and charisma, and laid out at an extremely fast pace. By the time Arthas takes up the cursed sword Frostmourne and sells his soul for petty revenge, the game is only a quarter of the way done, and the kingdom of Azeroth is already completely doomed. Then, you swing around to the Undead campaign and your hero is still Arthas, a Death Knight now, on a mission to claim his own kingdom for the armies of the Undead. It's fantastic, and a little reminiscent of how Kerrigan bridges the gap between Terran and Zerg campaigns in StarCraft. It does mess with the momentum of the plot a bit, though. You end up wondering where Thrall went for a long time before you find out. But the Undead campaign has some fantastic missions and moments, like the destruction of the Elven kingdoms that gave rise to the Blood Elves, and the moment where Arthas turned Sylvanas Windrunner into a Banshee. These little moments end up catalyzing into events that shape and reshape World of Warcraft when the MMO rolls around, but here in Warcraft 3, world-shaking events happen basically every 45 minutes and snowball the entire length of the game until a demonic invasion of staggering proportions is cut off at the root. Pretty fun genre writing. Extremely fun plot development for a real-time strategy game. Enough can't be said either about the enduring attractiveness and charm of the game world and landscapes of Warcraft 3. Attention to detail, especially for a 3D game in 2002, is huge. It might come across as somewhat basic by today's standards, but Warcraft 3 set itself apart from other RTS titles of the time in its commitment to rich, vibrant color palette, high detail, and incorporation of hand-drawn art. It's got a bit of a cartoony vibe, not too cartoony, but enough to make the silliness and heavy-handedness of the plot seem perfectly reasonable against the excitingly expressive backgrounds of the game world. There's just nothing quite like it. The Warcraft aesthetic is unique to Blizzard, and the game establishes the exact tone and character of presentation that would go into World of Warcraft. The scope of events are so much larger than previous Warcraft titles as well. When the Orc campaign rolls around, it feels like a whole different game all of a sudden. That's a testament to how different all four factions are to control. The humans are more or less the same from previous titles, but with a lot of new mechanical units. The undead are a peculiar mix of Zerg creep and Protoss-based construction from StarCraft, and the orcs are retooled to rely on aggressive expansion. All of the strategies and playstyles contribute to the strong sense of personality that the different factions and races have. It gives real flavor and variety to the combat. Plus, the combat is the smoothest that Blizzard had ever made upon release, with expressive and bloody animations playing out across huge maps with multiple plot-driven objectives. The Orc campaign is completely different in tone from previous Warcraft Orc campaigns, and this plays out as a struggle between Thrall, a shaman who wants to turn the Orcs away from pillage and slaughter, and Grom Hellscream, who represents the more traditional kill-all-humans horde. Over the course of the campaign, you look for a new homeland for the Orcs in the mysterious continent of Kalimdor, and then seek to break the ancient bond between Orcs and their demon masters so that Thrall and the new horde can go their own way. It's a great storyline, and to throw a little honor and a little compassion into the otherwise blood and thunder Orcs makes them a lot more personable. Plus, Thrall's just a great character. Straightforward, sure, but memorable and likable. Plus, the Orc campaign showcases the greatest variety of level objectives in Warcraft 3. Level objectives are much more interesting than in previous games, but the Orc campaign really takes the cake in widely varied goals and rhythms. During the Orc campaign, the fourth playable race is also unveiled, the Night Elves. The Night Elves are new to the setting, but according to all the new lore Warcraft 3 brought to the table, they've been around for tens of thousands of years. Their backstory, and the backstory of the main characters in the Night Elf campaign, are collected in Richard A. Knack's War of the Ancients trilogy. The Night Elf campaign is actually kind of hindered by all the backstory in the novels. An ancient love triangle is given a lot more narrative attention than it's worth because it's so key to the lore of these three books. But the Night Elves might be the most distinctive race to play out of all four, and the plotline incorporates and wraps up many of the dangling plot threads from the other three campaigns. Some plot items are left deliberately unaddressed, but the build-up to the climax and the climax itself is completely worthy of a game this epic in scope. Trying to slow the inevitable, crushing advance of a demon army at Mount Hyjal as a trap is laid, it's a phenomenal setup executed perfectly. Warcraft 3 was not only the right game at the right time, a truly cutting-edge RTS in terms of presentation and use of 3D, but it was also a triumph of the multimedia art of game design. Warcraft 3 is not especially original in any single aspect of itself, not the story, not the gameplay, not the technology, but the way it makes each one of those three pillars of design support the others is flat-out brilliant. The narrative serves the gameplay, and the technology gives vibrant definition to both. And all with a winning charm that's pretty much irresistible. It's no wonder Warcraft 3 is such a classic. Even better, its expansion does for the third game what Beyond the Dark Portal did for the second. Like Warcraft 2's expansion, the Frozen Throne assumes that you've beaten the main game, so you won't mind if it starts out hard and just gets harder. Nobody minds. Unlike Beyond the Dark Portal, the upswing in difficulty is still manageable for less skilled players, although it presents considerably more challenging and varied situations than the original campaign. It has a different feel to it than Warcraft 3's main campaign to boot, a little more carefree and deliberately weird, alongside the typical high fantasy melodrama. It isn't immediately apparent just how different it is from the main game, though. The first campaign, the Night Elf one, is the least impressive, and it's kind of a drag to get through. Maiev, the central character, is obtuse and unlikable, and the plot is muddled. 6 hours of chasing after Illidan directly after the main Night Elf campaign, where you're doing sort of the same thing, is not that great pacing. I just don't find Illidan a compelling character, either. His voice actor is a massive ham, and the brooding anti-hero is a 99-cent cliché. Still, the introduction of the Naga and revisiting the Tomb of Sargeras, last seen in Warcraft 2, are pretty fun moments. The Naga function as a kind of fifth race alongside the primary four, and a particularly lethal one at that. Fighting them is fun. Having to spend hours more playing Night Elf missions after the main campaign is over is a slow, ponderous introduction to an otherwise amazing expansion. But things really pick up in the Blood Elf campaign, which follows Prince Kael'thas as he rallies the survivors of the Elven genocide Arthas commits over the course of the main game's Undead campaign. The elves are mistreated and spat on by the rest of the Alliance, and when the Naga show up to offer their help, Kael'thas leaps at the chance. It's really interesting seeing him struggle with his people's destiny and duty, and the pacing picks up a lot of speed. The Elven variants on human units and structures are fantastic, and new units, like the Spellbreakers, add some fun new tactical strategy to the mix. In all the expansion campaigns, new units are given special prominence. Frozen Throne features a ton of dungeon missions, many more than even Warcraft 3. Effectively using all the units and abilities at your disposal, especially these new units, is the only way to really get through them. They're certainly the most robust dungeon missions of the Warcraft trilogy besides. Huge, fun, and chock-full of secrets. There's even a secret level you can get to. When the Blood Elves flee the Alliance, they cross with the Naga into what's left of the Shattered Realm of Draenor, now called Outland. That crossing is featured in a fantastic bonus level, a fast-paced, wild, pleasantly bizarre tower defense map. Tower defense would become one of the most popular sorts of custom maps for Frozen Throne, of which there were many. The modding scene for Frozen Throne was tremendous back in the day. The biggest breakout hit of the modding community was, of course, Defense of the Ancients, or Dota, which began as a custom map for Frozen Throne and later was released as a standalone sequel, much like how Natural Selection was originally a Half-Life mod before getting its own retail release. The fan-made maps are typically much more complicated than the multiplayer maps that shipped with the game, too. But nobody's really able to imitate Blizzard's weird and wild sense of humor. Like the timeless gag lines when you click the same unit over and over again, or the way the Pandaren are randomly introduced in the secret level not to be seen again until World of Warcraft, or finally in a later level where you find the majestic Penguin King. Frozen Throne has hilarious secrets and throwaway gags in practically every corner of its maps, and this, combined with the exceptionally clever challenges of the levels and the wide variation in mission objectives, give the impression that the Frozen Throne is all about giving players what they like and what they want most out of a Warcraft RTS experience. The Undead campaign is a particularly satisfying way to cap things off, too. It starts out following Arthas and Sylvanas Windrunner. Coming back to these characters after so much else going on in the plot is a lot of fun, and they do have fun with it. Arthas, as the campaign goes on, loses levels up until the final mission. It's the hardest campaign, and the last one of the franchise, after all, before it becomes an MMO. If they're not putting you in a position of constant disadvantage, they're not making the level challenging enough. Arthas eventually becomes the Lich King, and Sylvanas splinters a faction of free-willed undead off from Arthas' main army and occupies the ruins of Lordaeron. You know, the final plot events leading up to World of Warcraft. While the initial, original quests and plotlines of vanilla World of Warcraft are gone, possibly for good, following the Cataclysm expansion, players are still able to follow most of the plot threads from Frozen Throne, Warcraft 3, and Beyond the Dark Portal. Wrath of the Lich King is pretty much a direct sequel to the Undead campaign here in Frozen Throne. But what happened to the Orc campaign? Well, something really peculiar happened to it. It became a 100% hero-focused World of Warcraft prequel bonus campaign called The Founding of Durotar. It was released in 3 parts as free DLC long before DLC was even common terminology, and it is a very strange, frequently overlooked link between the legacy of the real-time strategy trilogy and the MMO that would come to overshadow them. All of the base-building portions of Warcraft 3 and the Frozen Throne are removed, and buildings are resized to be a more proportionate scale to your hero. Your hero, in this case, is the half-ogre Rexxar, who also made a recent reappearance in Warlords of Draenor. Rexxar comes down from his isolation in the wilderness to find Thrall deep in the process of constructing Orgrimmar, the Orc capital. Players lead Rexar as he completes quests to help Thrall, marked by little yellow exclamation points. He slays monsters for experience, money, and loot, and then he completes optional dungeons. It is literally all of the bare-bones gameplay formatting of World of Warcraft in archaic miniature. It's a weird game to play for these reasons. It's a little on the boring side, to be honest, because it has none of World of Warcraft's polish and all of its grind. The first chapter takes place in Durotar, with a few diversions to help the trolls on their islands. It's mostly centered around one gigantic map. The second chapter takes place across many tiny maps, but also ties up a ton of loose ends, like why the ogres left the Horde at the end of Warcraft 2, what Karen Bloodhoof and Jaina Proudmoore have been doing since the end of Warcraft 3, that sort of thing. At the end of the chapter, Jaina's dad, Admiral Proudmoore, shows up. He's a veteran character from Warcraft 2, so he knows better than to believe that a peace with the Horde is possible. Then the third chapter is a fantastic assault on Proudmoore's island fortress. I'd always wondered why the coast of Durotar was littered with shipwrecks. Now I know. Interestingly, the second and third chapters incorporate naval combat back into the game in a way not seen since Warcraft 2. It doesn't use oil, but naval combat is big. It's done through mercenaries. In a lot of ways, it's a fitting farewell, touching on many of the key features, characters, and themes of the strategy trilogy while orienting towards heroes being more important than armies for the MMO. Blizzard doesn't seem to have any plans to swing the emphasis back in the other direction either. 10 years in, and World of Warcraft is still a dominant force in MMOs. Blizzard did, however, release HD models of all of the Warcraft 3 and Frozen Throne resources for use in StarCraft 2's map editor. Blizzard might not be making Warcraft 4, but they gave players all the tools they need to do the job themselves. This is an amazing gesture by the company, one that rewards the fans who haven't been able to get this franchise out of their head for 20 years. World of Warcraft's success is built not only on the virtues of that game alone, but the fact that the world of Warcraft literally grew up alongside the medium as it developed. All the lore, all the geography, all the art, it all accumulated and matured across these early titles as the games changed from unsure, unsteady concept tests to these gorgeous 3D battlefields with dozens of complex systems of advancement and abilities popping off and guiding the action with an incredible smoothness. Gaming changed so much from 2004 to 2014, sure, but it did not change half as much as from 1999 to 2004. It's a remarkable progression, and that progression is illustrated in microcosm across this charming trilogy. Thanks for taking a look back at them with me. This is the end of the main portion of the video. What follows is an appendix on how to install and run the first two games from CD on Windows using a program called DOSBox, and then a special thanks to Patreon subscribers. So, you've still got your Warcraft 1 and 2 discs, but you haven't used them in years. Or you've never played them before, but you're curious about the early games. Luckily, both Warcraft 1 and 2 are classified as abandonware now, and are available to download for free using links here in the video description. To play using those versions, please also see an attached link about installing from disk image. This tutorial uses the CDs. Just install DOSBox and insert the Warcraft 1 CD to continue. First, you want to mount your CD drive by typing mount space E // space -T space CD-ROM, or whatever the letter of your CD-ROM drive is, usually D if you only have one hard drive. Then you'll mount your C drive for installation. It'll warn you against it, but we're just going to do it this once real quick. Just type mount space C space C :/. Then type E :/ to access your CD drive. Type install and follow the prompts. Do the default audio setup and it'll run just fine. Then, when setup is complete, type war to play. When you open up DOSBox again, you just want to type mount space C space C :/ Warcraft, and then bring up the C command prompt and type war to play. Installing Warcraft 2 is essentially the same. Mount your C drive as the Warcraft folder using mount space C space C :/ Warcraft, as well as mounting your disk drive with the mount space E space E :/ space -T space CD-ROM. Then bring up the eDrive prompt and type install again with the defaults. This one will install within your Warcraft folder if it says it's installing to C War 2. When it completes, type War 2 to play. To run later, mount your C drive as mount space C space C :/ Warcraft /War 2 and then type War 2 at the C prompt.
Your sound card works perfectly.
The Beyond the Dark Portal expansion is also quite easy. Just mount the disk drive, then mount the C drive as C:\\Warcraft\War2, and then install. If it was a success, you'll be given the options for all 4 campaigns in the new game menu of Warcraft 2. Note that the videos for the campaigns are stored on the disks, so you'll need the correct disk inserted for either the Tides of Darkness or Beyond the Dark Portal campaigns. Let's Play enthusiasts should also note that DOSBox has a built-in video recorder which you can toggle with Ctrl-Alt-F5. Good luck and good gaming.
Thanks again for watching. I'd also like to thank by name some people who are pledged at $10 a month or more on Patreon. That includes Cassie Bayer, Pat Hay, Connor Biblo, Joshua Hartnett, Brad Wallace, Ryan Gunst, Preston Allen, Espen Snizensez, Soad Sheik, Sigmund Copperwood, Stephen Lark, Junas, Amir Aguilar, Christine Zachariansen, Ken Young, William Kreutsch, Akan Siliguio, Richard Stevenson, Stephen Person, Signa Jensen, Kimbo Heikkinen, Jay Schmitz, Joe Wolf, Oliver H., White Zero, Yuri Petrus, Sill, Dalton Seiler, Carlos Perea, and Jonathan Fleischner. Also, big thanks to everyone else who's pledged to me on Patreon currently. It's helped me cut down my hours at the pizzeria, and I really appreciate it a lot. Thanks for watching.
But because even in the decade before WoW, the franchise was an industry groundbreaker. Warcraft is at the root of so many of today's most popular games. StarCraft, Defense of the Ancients, and more trace their lineage back to Blizzard's genuinely classic real-time strategy trilogy. If you go back to 1994's original flavor Warcraft, there is absolutely no way that you or me or anyone would say, oh, this is definitely going to make hundreds of millions of dollars over the course of 2 decades. But it did. And that uncertainty is there if you go back to gaming in 1994 from whatever angle you look at it. The original Warcraft came out at a time when the genres of today were still being invented and defined. Warcraft, alongside Westwood's Command & Conquer series, established the basic mechanics and rhythms that real-time strategy games still use today, more or less. The original Warcraft is a pretty distant ancestor in a lot of ways, complexity, polish, pacing, but the fun thing about it is that a player only familiar with StarCraft 2 would still be able to figure it out and excel at it within pretty short order. Not many gamers these days remember the first Warcraft, but they don't need to. Whether it's gameplay mechanics or characters who still pop up from time to time in World of Warcraft, the legacy that grew from the first game is arguably much more impressive than the game itself. That doesn't make it any less interesting to go back and take a look at it, though, 20 years after the fact. The game is an incredible pain in the ass. All of your production structures produce one unit at a time with no queue, and a feature that would be dropped for later titles, all your structures must be connected along a road network. While the units are a good tactical mix, you may only select 4 at a time. Only 4. That, more than any other shortcoming, makes this game really difficult to play. Only being able to control a tiny handful of units is made more problematic by a more aggressive fog of war than nearly any RTS I've seen besides Total Annihilation. You start out most maps not even knowing where a gold mine is, not being able to see where the forests start. In this way, Warcraft requires a lot of patience to explore the map and make a tactical assessment of what you're even supposed to do. Later Blizzard games, starting with StarCraft, put a lot of effort into giving the player clear direction. Warcraft 1 does not. To win Warcraft, you have to fight the enemy, sure, but you also have to fight the fact that your units are dumber than a bag of hammers. They're very bad at anything that you do not tell them to do, and even then it's possible they might walk halfway across the map in the wrong direction to die, even if you tell them exactly what it is you want from them. If you leave them to their own devices, units almost never engage with the enemy unless they're attacked directly. If you don't notice your base being attacked, your defenders will actually sit there giving
Hi, I'm theyve. This past year, World of Warcraft turned 10 and Warcraft the franchise turned 20. This video takes a look at the first 10 years of the Warcraft franchise, which takes the form of 3 really incredible real-time strategy games. One released in '94, one released in '95, and the third one released in 2002. These games really grew up alongside gaming as a medium, and it's really fascinating to look back at the trilogy as a whole, especially how it came to shape World of Warcraft. Let's get started.
This past year, Warcraft celebrated its 20th anniversary. Blizzard, the company behind Warcraft, has come up from very humble beginnings to occupy an incredibly unusual position in the business world, a financial juggernaut that the fans really love and that really loves its fans back. The Warcraft franchise has been the keys to the kingdom for Blizzard, not just because World of Warcraft is such a solid game. Older games are noted for their complexity relative to today's games, but in terms of real-time strategy, that's not always the case. With war games like these, complexity has generally gone up as technology improves. The better the hardware, the more numerous the units. The fancier the animations, the bigger the battlefields, and the larger the number of play options. Although real-time strategy was a viable genre since the early 80s, Warcraft 1 is at the very beginning of computers being fast enough to render large battles in actual real-time with enough pixels to give the player a pretty good idea of what was going on. Westwood's Dune 2, released in 1992, beat Warcraft to the punch in terms of general formatting, but Warcraft is very much its own RTS, from setting to mechanics to attitude. It's also very difficult. The difficulty in the first Warcraft is, unfortunately, as much from clunky interface and poor unit AI as from the campaign's intended strategic challenge. I've talked a lot about how important Warcraft 1 was in establishing an enduring gameplay template, but it is very much a rough draft of the template. The basics are all there. Use your peasants or peons to harvest gold from mines and lumber from trees, build farms to increase your unit cap, build your army from one or more barracks, upgrade your town hall to access the next tier of units and buildings, defend, attack, win. All the things that are enjoyable about all the Blizzard strategy games, Warcraft or StarCraft. But doing those things here in the first game, the raiding party stern looks until you explicitly tell them to do something about it. The game even knows this. Control of the map is all about control of bridges and other choke points, where enemy units literally cannot get by without directly attacking your forces and provoking a response. Units are also a lot more fragile than later titles, which, coupled with only being able to select 4 units at a time, can lead to assaults that fall apart so quickly while you struggle to micromanage. Strangely, the easiest way to overcome this is to slow down the game speed, take the real-time out of the real-time strategy. As the units agonizingly inch their way across the screen, you can issue attack orders more leisurely, and make sure that you don't have just a few of your units hit the enemy's front lines, just die as the rest of your raiding party gets hung up on a stand of trees. From a technical perspective, it's all kinda janky. But Warcraft had more going for it than just bare-bones gameplay. It has huge personality for a simple little game. Art direction and sound design, even here in 1994, are quite distinctively Warcraft. A fun, memorable blend of bright, cartoonish art with a lot of blood and a lot of charmingly distinctive character and building designs, backed by an upbeat and likable soundtrack, expressive sound effects, and a winkingly silly ambient dialogue. Warcraft is kind of a chore to play, but it's a chore that